Good morning, everyone. My name is Jaya George. Thank you for joining us and being part of BIANJ's annual seminar. Before we get started, I would like to remind everyone to enter your full name in the chat. This is our virtual sign-in sheet. If you are going to request CEUs, remember that you must attend this workshop to the end, complete the workshop evaluation, and if requested by your discipline, complete a post-test. Zoom will provide a report of how long each of you stayed in the workshop. CEUs cannot be given if attendance is not verified. Questions are encouraged. Please enter questions in the chat box and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. So today's workshop is New Jersey Traumatic Brain Injury Model System Center's Progress Update. And our presenters are Dr. Golden and Dr. Chiravalotti. Dr. Golden is a clinical and research neuropsychologist at JFK Johnson Rehabilitation Institute and the project director of their TBI Model System Center. She has over a decade of experience doing research, neuropsychological assessments, and cognitive rehabilitation with individuals with TBI and other neurocognitive disorders. Welcome, Dr. Golden. Dr. Chiravalotti is Director of Neuropsychology, Neuroscience, and Traumatic Brain Injury Research at the Kessler Foundation and a Research Professor of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at Rutgers University, New Jersey Medical School, and the Project Director of the Northern New Jersey Traumatic Brain Injury Model System. Dr. Chiravalotti has obtained over $16 million in grant funding, at least half of which being in brain injury. So thank you to both of you, and the stage is yours.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to share my presentation. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending our talk. I am going to first give a brief introduction of what traumatic brain injury model systems programs are. Then I'll tell you a little bit about the research that we're doing at JFK, and then Dr. Chiravalotti is going to talk to you about the research that they're doing at Kessler under this program. So Traumatic Brain Injury Model System Centers program was created in 1987 by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. And the goal of the program is to demonstrate the benefits of a coordinated system of neurotrauma rehabilitation care, the whole continuum of care from acute rehabilitation and all the way through to community reintegration for individuals who sustain a traumatic brain injury. The mission is really to improve the lives of patients, their families, to improve their functioning in the community and reduce the burden on individuals and community as a whole. And over the years, this program has collaborated and expanded its reach through multiple other programs like Veterans Affairs. There are now actually some VA centers in addition to the traditional civilian centers, which I'll tell you about more. Department of Defense, NINDS, and from the National Institutes of Health and Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. So when we think about the civilian centers, which our two centers are, there are six, they have traditionally and continue to be 16 centers throughout the United States. And there are certain requirements that a center needs to meet to be a traumatic brain injury model system center. First and foremost, we must provide a comprehensive system of brain injury care. So for individuals with traumatic brain injury, including everything from a trauma to acute rehabilitation, outpatient rehabilitation, all the way through community participation. We must also conduct site-specific research, multi-site research in collaboration with other centers, which we call modules. And we must also contribute and participate in a longitudinal database. So the database involves collecting specific information at the time of inpatient rehabilitation, at the time of discharge from inpatient rehabilitation, and then 1 year, 2 years, and every 5 years thereafter after injury. So in this sense, we get to follow patients from the very moment they sustain a traumatic brain injury, and as long as a center has funding for the remainder of their lives. And at this point, there have been, as you can see, thousands of participants enrolled in the database over many, many years that this project has been going on. This is a grant-funded research, so every center is funded for 5 years, and every 5 years we apply for recompetition. So in New Jersey, we're fortunate enough, being the most densely populated state in the country, to have 2 model system centers. One is at the JFK Johnson Rehabilitation Institute, and the other one is at Kessler Foundation, Kessler Institute for Rehabilitation. So first, I'm going to describe the research that we're engaged in as part of our local project at JFK Johnson, and then Dr. Ciavarlotti is going to describe the local site research project at Kessler's Northern New Jersey Model System. What you'll notice as we're going through this is the projects between our centers are quite different, and as they are among all the 16 centers across the country. And it's this diversity and focus of the research that all the centers conduct that really contributes to the success of the model systems programs in really advancing the science and the delivery of brain injury rehabilitation for all these years. So at JFK Johnson, our project focuses on understanding and tracking activity limitations in the course of traumatic brain injury and recovery. So as most of you know, TBI affects the brain in a variety of ways. It can disrupt physical functioning, cognitive functioning, and emotional functioning. And these impairments can in turn impact a person's ability to perform daily activities, which includes both basic activities such as bathing, grooming, dressing, feeding, mobility, and it also impacts instrumental activities, which include things like meal preparation, shopping, financial management, medication management, communication, transportation, and so on. And these activity limitations can in turn make engagement in life situations extremely challenging. As rehabilitation professionals, we want to try to understand the post-TBI challenges I described in the previous slide, and we do this through functional assessment. And functional assessment uses instruments that helps us to identify the types of difficulties patients experience and assign what we hope to be a meaningful score or number to quantify the extent of these difficulties. And there are certain things that can determine the type of or degree of difficulty that a person might have in performing normal activities. We want to try to identify rehabilitation needs. We want to select optimal treatments. We want to evaluate the treatment effectiveness. It helps us identify accommodation and support needs. It helps us determine community reintegration and also reimbursement for services and other financial consideration really depend on what functional assessment tells us. When we think about functional domains and when we think about functioning in general, it can be conceptualized to exist on 3 different levels. And although in this slide it's presented in a linear manner, the relationship between these levels is actually not very simple or direct. And there's a lot of interaction. So at the most basic level is impairment. And we can think of impairment as the injury's direct impact on the mechanisms that give rise to meaningful behaviors. So the underlying body functions that are the precursors to meaningful activities. And these are usually assessed through construct-led measures, and those measures try to capture the integrity of the underlying processes necessary for successful task completion, but they don't necessarily measure the task itself. So think about, for example, neuropsychological assessment. We assess specific cognitive operations and we try to make inferences about what that would mean in terms of daily functions. But we're doing this based on cognitive functioning without necessarily observing those daily functions. And what we know from ecological validity literature is that this level of assessment doesn't always accurately predict activity or limitations in performing those activities. Then the next level is the activity limitations level. And this level aims to assess difficulty in executing actual real world tasks. And it's usually aimed at instrumental activities of daily living, but can also include some of the more basic things like mobility and self-care. And this is obviously affected by impairment, and it can translate to difficulties in community participation. To date, and I'll tell you more about the measure that we're studying, which is the focus of our project, but in general, there haven't been a lot of measures that can specifically target activity limitations across different disciplines and across different domains. Usually activity limitations is assessed by self-report or proxy report. And sometimes it can be assessed by an observer rating, usually in a simulated environment. The problem with simulated environments is that they tend to be too sterile and too controlled, and they're less indicative of real world activity performance than patient or proxy reports. So typically relying on patient or proxy reports to assess activity limitations has been the gold standard. This level of assessment also doesn't provide information about any impairments that may be leading to activity limitations, nor does it provide information about the actual translation of that activity performance to community participation. With that in mind, assessment at this level is much more predictive of functioning in the community and engaging and participating in real world activities than measuring impairment itself. And finally, participation refers to involvement in life situations. While this is the ultimate and final outcome, there are numerous factors that are far, far beyond the control of rehabilitation, which renders this an ineffective treatment target domain. Another way of looking at this is to consider that impairment reflects capacity of the organism to perform under optimal conditions. Participation is synonymous with performance of what actually occurs in everyday life. And activity performance and activity limitations is the relevant middle ground between capacity and performance, and an area that represents rehabilitation professionals with the greatest opportunity to modify performance. So we consider this the most meaningful target for traumatic brain injury rehabilitation. But because it is the most meaningful target for traumatic brain injury rehabilitation, it's also vital to be able to measure this as accurately as possible. So once we've determined that activity limitations and improvement in our ability to perform functional tasks and activities of daily living is the most proximal meaningful goal of rehabilitation, it's also important to understand the principles and challenges related to the assessment of this domain. Because rehabilitation professionals are tasked with the responsibility of measuring progress and demonstrating treatment effectiveness, and also measuring this domain in order to be able to select the most optimal treatment targets. So as we all know, traumatic brain injuries vary greatly between people in cause, in severity, and in recovery, which results in variability in functional abilities of patients who sustain TBI. There's been a growing appreciation that TBI is a chronic condition, which means that functional recovery after a traumatic brain injury can occur over the course of days, of months, but some activities may take years to recover. And not only can different functions recover at different rates, but some functions may also remain compromised or even worsen, which will require further specialized treatments. So given the diversity of limitations and recovery after TBI, it's essential to have tools that can assess this large range of activity performance and to track functional recovery trajectories over time and across treatment settings. And unfortunately, this last piece being able to track performance with the same measure across time, across settings, is the critical feature that's missing from currently available functional measures. So this very busy slide provides details about the Impact Act of 2014. And the gist of it is that this law highlighted the most critical limitations of widely used functional assessment tools. Many tools have floor or ceiling effects. Many tools lean too heavily towards impairment. So if we think about the traditional tools that we use in rehabilitation, especially in inpatient rehabilitation, we used to, it's changed, but we used to use the FIM. And the FIM really does rely heavily on limitations in functioning, which may not always translate really well to performance of specific activities. And most of the tools have generally been impractical in more than one specific rehabilitation setting, which prevents us from being able to track functioning across the continuum of care without having to switch to a different tool or a different metric, which also prevents us from being able to compare scores and compare results across the rehabilitation continuum. So one solution that was developed as part of this act, it was the implementation of the CARE tool, the Continuity Assessment Record and Evaluation. It's replaced the FIM in inpatient rehabilitation settings, still not clear how it translates to other settings, especially in the community. And from what we've learned through some crosswalk research within the TBI model systems community is that there's a good correspondence between the CARE tool and FIM motor, but it does not provide us the same information as the FIM cognitive domains did. So again, we're not sure that we're measuring the same things that we used to measure. So again, there remains a need to identify functional measures that can reliably capture all aspects of functional performance reliably. So there's a need to implement these functional assessment tools that are capable of capturing the occurrence of and changes in functional limitations over time to accurately assess patient needs and to assess treatment effectiveness. And gathering data on functional recovery across settings between patients and over time will contribute to the yet limited understanding of post-functional TBI recovery. So in response to this, we have identified a new tool or a relatively new tool called the Activity Measure for Post-Acute Care, or as for short, the AMPAC. This is a functional outcome systems tool developed for use across all post-acute care settings, from inpatient, traumatic brain injury rehabilitation, and all the way through community reintegration. It allows for tracking patients' functional status using the focus on activity limitations as they move across the entire continuum of care. It was developed by researchers at Boston University, and it was developed using the World Health Organization's International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, the ICD. Measures, and it measures the functional status of adults with various diagnoses across all settings. It can be completed by patients or proxies, and the recommendations are that while patients are hospitalized, the proxies should be care professionals that are working with patients, so usually rehabilitation therapists. And when they're out in the community, or receiving outpatient rehabilitation, the proxies could be therapists, but most ideal proxies are caregivers or family members. And it was developed with consideration of the multifaceted nature of activity functioning. It includes specific functional domains, basic mobility, daily activities, and applied cognition. So again, it captures all the different functional domains and the various components of functioning, from motor to day-to-day activities to more higher order cognitive tasks. And it also captures different aspects of activity performance. So it captures difficulty in performing activities, it captures need for assistance in performing activities, and it captures limitations related to that. Slides are not advancing. There we go. So it has various forms and items. It's comprised of over 300 functional activities organized in these three functional areas: mobility, daily activity, and applied cognitive. And there's a computer version and a pen and paper based version. So the pen and paper based versions are not very long. They have about a dozen questions for each domain. The computer adaptive version is much more time and resource conservative. It was developed using item reduction theory, where each subsequent item is selected from this large item bank based on a previous response. So it eliminates items that are too easy or too difficult. Thereby, it significantly cuts the time and number of items and therefore burden on patient response. So usually each domain has about 5 to 6 items, which captures activity limitations. The nice thing about this is that all AMPAC forms, all versions, and also all types of responders yields the same metrics. So ultimately, it converts it to scores that are comparable and have been shown to be comparable in other populations across all types of administration and also across different responders and settings. So the AMPAC was developed and validated in individuals with stroke, with complex medical conditions, with orthopedic injuries, but it has not yet been fully studied and validated in individuals with TBI. And what a good measure it would be for individuals with TBI. The AMPAC provides 2 different types of scores. One score is a T-score conversion, which provides really meaningful scores for clinicians to be able to track and understand changes and differences. But it also provides meaningful and digestible information for consumers. So for patients, for caregivers, for insurance companies, it provides functional stages, which really gives a meaningful context for interpretations. It has score ranges that get converted to functional stages, and functional stage reflects a specific activity profile. They're hierarchical, and each stage represents increasingly more the ability to perform increasingly more difficult activities. So this is an example of what the stages are. So for example, for basic mobility, it'll go from complete dependence and very limited movement to being able to do fully strenuous activities and sports. For daily activities, it'll go from not being able to perform any tasks independently to being fully on your own. And as you can see, there's a nice description that really helps people understand what sorts of limitations are present and what types of activities and assistance people might be able to do and require. And for applied cognitive, again, you have limited ability to apply cognitive skills to being completely independent in all areas of cognitive function. So by looking at this tool and by considering everything that I've discussed so far, what we concluded is that the AMPAC can really potentially bridge the gaps of functional assessment. It can help us hone in on this very relevant, rehabilitation relevant area of activity limitations. And it can help us have a measure that can really provide the same metric and the same measure across the entire rehabilitation continuum. Not only that, but it meets the current legislative standards and requirements of the Impact Act that suggest that we need to have the same metric to track functional activities across the continuum. But it has not been validated in individuals with TBI. So that is really the focus of our current local project at JFK through our model systems grant, is to evaluate this tool in individuals with TBI. So we have 2 general objectives. One is to evaluate the applicability of the AMPAC for use with individuals with TBI. And the second is to use it to assess activity limitations over the course of TBI rehabilitation. So our first aim is to evaluate the sensitivity of the AMPAC to measure changes in activity limitations in TBI. And we're using two different ways to do this. One is by tracking it across the using it to track activity limitations across the first year of injury. And the other is to use it to study changes pre and post specialized outpatient brain injury rehabilitation. We're also looking to examine the relationship between the AMPAC scales and some of the traditional functional scales across different disciplines. So we're really looking to validate this. And the third aim is to evaluate patient proxy agreement. Now, in other populations where it's been validated, patient and proxy agreement has been excellent. So no matter who completes the form, it yields very, very comparable scores. However, taken into account that patients with brain injuries can often have cognitive impairments and sometimes limitations in their awareness of deficits, we thought that it would be critical to evaluate whether patient report is similar to what proxies are reporting as well. So we're studying two different samples. These are just our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So to track activity limitations across the first year of injury, we're studying an inpatient sample. This is on our JRI brain trauma unit. So we're studying participants at the time of admission, discharge, 6 months post-injury, and then 1 year post-injury. So again, we're tracking their activity limitations while they're receiving inpatient rehabilitation, but also following them across the first year of injury. And the reason we selected a 6-point mark in addition to studying the 1 year is that there's been a lot of research suggesting that functional performance and activity limitations can sometimes take a dive during that 6-month mark. So sometime between the injury and 1 year post-injury, patients tend to get worse before they get better. And we wanted to see if this actually happens, and instituted the 6-month follow-up to see if we would be able to capture a decline in performance before patients continue to improve again. And for our outpatient sample, we're studying individuals who are presenting to our outpatient cognitive rehabilitation program, and looking and studying them before and after they receive cognitive rehabilitation. So for the inpatient longitudinal sample, our outcome measures, in addition to the AMPAC, which is our primary outcome measure that we're validating, we're using the FIM, and we're using the participation assessment with recombined tools objective. So the FIM, as we all know, is a functional ability measure that assesses the severity of disability. It does tend to rely more or lean more towards impairment than activity limitations. And we're aware of that potential confounder, but this is, or at least when we designed the study before we switched to the CARE tool, was the gold standard for functional assessment during inpatient rehabilitation. And the Part O is an outcome scale that measures participation in the community. And it is part of the TBI model systems that is given at Form 1, that is given at year 1. So it fits nicely with a 1-year follow-up. And for our outpatient assessment, since our goal is to validate it against some of the existing functional tools within different rehabilitation professions, we're using the dynamic gait index as a proxy of basic mobility, and our physical therapists administer that. We're using the Texas Functional Living Scale as a proxy of daily activity. Our occupational therapists do that. And then we're using the Neuropsychological Assessment Battery Daily Living Scales, which is a performance-based measure of functional cognitive skills intended to evaluate cognitive abilities in relation to real-life tasks. And it really touches on 5 domains specific modules that contains a specific test that involves real world scenarios that are generalizable, targeted, and considered to be ecologically valid to demonstrate daily living tasks in everyday situations. And we're using the awareness item from the Mayo Portland Adaptability Inventory to look at whether or not there might be impaired self-awareness that might impact patient responding to the AMPAC. So this is briefly our design. So as I mentioned, for our inpatient sample, we're assessing patients at admission and discharge to the brain trauma unit, where they're also getting the FIM in addition to the AMPAC. At 6 months follow-up, we do a telephone interview, so we're only doing the AMPAC. And at 1 year post-injury, we're doing the AMPAC, but also the Part O, because that's when it's done with model systems as well. For outpatient, we're giving all the measures at admission and at discharge. So during the BTU stay, the AMPAC is collected from only therapists at admission, from therapists and patients at discharge, and then from patients only during follow-up. For outpatient, we're collecting the AMPAC from patients and whomever they identify as their proxy. So typically a family member or a friend who knows them really well, and preferably somebody they live with. And we're doing that again at admission and discharge. So we're a little bit over 3 years into data collection, although our data collection has been impacted by COVID over the past year. So I'm going to present some findings of what we have seen so far. So our first aim is to evaluate the sensitivity of the AMPAC to activity limitations and to track those limitations. So across the different scales, this is what we're seeing in our inpatient setting. Based from admission to discharge, so the blue lines represent therapist measures at admission and discharge, we're seeing very significant improvements in all three domains: in basic mobility, in daily activities, and in applied cognitive functioning. What is interesting, and we have consistently seen this every time we've looked at the data over the last 3.5 years, is that there's a big discrepancy between what the therapists are rating participants at discharge and what the participants are rating themselves at discharge in terms of their, and again, this is focusing on their ability to perform activities of daily living or on their limitations in performing them. But one thing we considered was maybe patients are not really aware of what difficulties they're going to have once they leave the hospital and re-enter the community. But what we're really seeing is that at 6 months and at 12 months, they're not only improving on some scales, but also maintaining the same level of performance they rated themselves to be at discharge. So one thing that might be happening is, again, that discrepancy between the FIM being more impairment focused, which doesn't always translate to somebody's ability to engage in activities. And what we've learned from discussing this with some of our therapists is that they are really using the FIM, or their functional impairment-based assessment, as a way of predicting what activity limitations patients might have. So again, it goes to show that somebody's impairment in basic underlying functions doesn't translate very cleanly to their ability to perform activities. And we know this from rehabilitation with patients, right? We know that when we think about compensatory approaches, we teach patients strategies to be able to engage in functions, to perform tasks in spite of what their underlying limitations might be, of what their underlying deficits might be. And this goes to show us that that is likely working well, and that patients are able to still engage in activities even in the potential presence of impairments in the systems that we consider to be necessary for those activities. But again, what's nice is that patients are improving and that they're maintaining gains. So we're not seeing that dip in between discharge and year one that a lot of literature suggests. These are the results from our outpatient sample. So you see here basic mobility, daily activity, and applied cognitive. And the left side of each each block shows patients' responses, and the right side of each block shows proxy responses. So we're seeing that patients and proxies are pretty much rating providing very comparable ratings. So a lot more agreement here than between patients and therapists. And we're also seeing some improvements from pre to post rehabilitation. So again, we're capturing improvements and we're capturing activity limitations. So our second aim was to examine the relationship between the AMPAC scales and traditional discipline-specific measures of function. So this is for the inpatient sample. And again, at admission and discharge, we compared it to FIM. And what we're seeing is really nice, significant correspondence at both admission and discharge between all scales on the AMPAC and both FIM scales. So again, one possibility is that there's a really nice correspondence between traditional measures and the AMPAC. Another possibility, as we've seen from the previous graphs, is that the FIM might be used as a proxy for responding to AMPAC items. There was nothing given for comparison at discharge, but at 1 year follow-up, we're comparing patients' responses to the AMPAC to patients' responses to activity participation. Now, we know that there are lots of things that can happen between being able to do an activity or having limitations in the activity and actually participating in society. Just because somebody's able to engage in something doesn't mean that they have a need or the desire to engage in something. So again, what we know from research and logically, there's not always a very direct relationship between activity limitations and community participation. But what we are seeing is that there is significant correspondence between all of the AMPAC scales and some of the really vital activities like working, socialization, shopping. So there is a really good translation between the AMPAC and community participation. For outpatient, we're seeing that being able to move, so the DGI corresponds to every single AMPAC scale. So obviously mobility is critical to be able to engage in any other activity of daily living, and it can present a significant limitation. We're also seeing that both basic mobility and applied cognitive relates to the Texas Functional Living Scale. And we are seeing that cognitive is loading on some of the neuropsychological measures that we predicted. We're seeing that at admission, but not so much at discharge. And we're not really sure right now why that's happening. What we are seeing is that patients are improving on all the traditional tasks. So again, one possibility may be that what our treatment targets are, and that we're targeting impairments more than we're targeting functional activities. Now, from what I know about our rehabilitation setting, that is certainly not the case. Although we measure and are aware of impairments, there's collaborative goal setting, and the rehabilitation focus really is on functional activities. So one possibility is that we don't have enough participants yet, but this is an interesting finding that we're going to keep monitoring. And our third aim was to evaluate agreement between patients and proxy responders. So as you might have imagined from seeing the graphs and the discrepancies between patients and therapists on the inpatient setting, there was not a lot of agreement between patients and therapists' responses, although there was significant agreement for mobility, but not for the other two domains. However, for the on the outpatient side, we had very strong and significant correspondence between patient and proxy responses. So once patients are out in the community, and are actually engaging in these activities, and somebody else, whoever's observing them, engaging their ability to engage in activities seems to agree with what the patients are perceiving. And again, we looked at awareness, and awareness did not play a part in the patient's response. So again, it's really good to see that whether or not patients are really aware of their deficits, they have really good insight into their ability to engage in meaningful activities of daily living, and that the way they rate themselves is very similar to the way others are rating them. So just the current status, our goal for each sample is to recruit 100 participants with the goal of retaining 80. So for inpatient, we've enrolled 70 so far. 50 have already completed 6 months follow-up, 31 have completed 1 year follow-up. We have had some withdrawals and losses to follow-up, but it's not as bad as we anticipated. But again, COVID has prohibited us from recruiting any new participants over the past year. So we're hoping to be able to get back on board soon. For outpatient, we've enrolled about 80 participants at this point. Some of them withdrew prior to completing admission testing. Some of them also enrolled, but then COVID started and we were never able to even complete admission testing. So we have 63 completed admission testing and 53 discharged. Some are pending and some were lost due to COVID. But again, we're not exactly on track, but just so you can see the numbers the current data is based on. So what we've learned so far really is that the AMPAC can be completed by various responders for individuals with TBI. Although if we continue to do this, there's definitely a need to examine more closely what is happening inpatient, and why there is such a significant discrepancy between therapists and patient responders. We're also seeing that it is able to measure activity limitations in individuals with TBI. Those large discrepancies between patients and therapists during inpatient rehab are concerning. And again, it could be because it's reflecting impairment-based assessment or orientation by therapists versus activity-based orientation by patients. But it may also be just a function of the fact that patients know themselves better and they know what activities they're really good at. And we know that impairment doesn't always translate directly to activities. But that is something definitely for us to explore more. What we're also seeing is that the AMPAC scores may not correspond well to some of the traditional clinic-based functional assessment tools. So we don't know what the optimal measurement really is. But we know that a lot of those tools do depend a little bit highly on impairment. And again, I think it does come down to the difference between underlying impairments and the degree to which they interfere with activities and activity participation. And going back to the goal of rehabilitation, and the goal of rehabilitation is to certainly repair whatever deficits are repairable, but also with a large focus on providing and implementing strategies to overcome those impairments in order to be able to engage in activities. That goes to reason that targeting and assessing activity limitations and activity participation is probably a more meaningful way to track and measure rehabilitation. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Cervellotti now. Thank you so much for listening to my talk.
Thank you, Yelena. And I am going to now screen share. Okay, so as Dr. Golden mentioned, the TBI model system is composed of 16 centers, and we all have very distinct site-specific projects. They are really quite different, and they address all different topics in TBI rehabilitation. The topic that we are addressing during the current cycle at the Kessler Foundation is applying strategy-based techniques to enhance memory to treat new learning and memory deficits in individuals with TBI. So this is a newly developed cognitive rehabilitation protocol that focuses on learning and memory. And this study tests that rehabilitation protocol specifically in individuals with traumatic brain injury. So just briefly to review the concomitants of traumatic brain injury results in a number of different challenges to individuals, including physical deficits, changes in emotional functioning, behavioral changes, as well as cognitive deficits. I focus the large portion of my work on cognition and rehabilitating cognitive deficits. So I really feel it's always important to ask the question, why do we care about cognition? Because this really guides our research. Cognitive deficits lead to depression and anxiety. They lead to decreased participation, increased unemployment, and overall a decreased quality of life. In the reverse, improving cognition could thus lead to decreasing emotional symptomatology, increased participation in the community, hopefully a return to work, as well as improved quality of life. And there is some literature out there that improved cognition does lead to these positive outcomes. So if we focus in on cognition and trying to improve cognition, we will hopefully improve these outcomes for individuals living with traumatic brain injury. There are a number of cognitive changes following traumatic brain injury. Cognitive deficits are very common. We see deficits in executive functioning, we see processing speed deficits, we see working memory deficits, and we also see problems in attention. Memory dysfunction is the cardinal feature post-TBI. When you ask someone about their cognition, they generally complain about memory dysfunction and that it's very disruptive to their everyday lives. So when we talk about memory dysfunction, it's important to understand the memory process because memory is not a unitary construct that is very simple to understand and intervene. So when you look at memory, the memory process, it can be broken down into three major stages. The first is encoding. The term encoding refers to the ability to acquire new information. So when someone you just meet tells you their name or tells you their phone number, that is acquiring new information so that you can use that information later. Once you acquire that information, the next stage is consolidation. And consolidation really refers to hardening that information, making it durable and solid and something that can then be called up later. So when I think about encoding and consolidation, I like to use the analogy of building a house. Encoding would be pouring the foundation as you pour the concrete into to create the foundation. Consolidation would be walking away for 24 hours and allowing that concrete to harden. And much of consolidation happens when we sleep. The final stage in the memory process is retrieval. Retrieval is what gets blamed for our memory problems because that's when we realize we're having difficulty. Retrieval is when we're trying to call up that information and use it. So you learn a coworker's name the first time you see them, and then you see them again the next day, and you have to retrieve that information. And when you can't retrieve that information, that's when you say, oh my goodness, my memory is terrible. Typically, people will then say, I can't recall or I can't remember. And what they're blaming the process on, what they're blaming the impairment on is an inability to retrieve that information. However, our research is showing that that is not the case in individuals with brain injury. What we've been showing is that memory dysfunction following TBI is really a product of poor learning. This was a study, the results of a study that were designed to specifically look at learning versus retrieval in individuals with brain injury. The data depicts results of a LIST learning test And the protocol involved reading a list of words repeatedly to individuals with traumatic brain injury and reading the same list of words repeatedly to individuals who were healthy. What we were trying to determine is how many repetitions of the list were required for someone to learn that information. And learning that information was defined as 2 perfect repetitions of that list of words. It took individuals with TBI significantly more repetitions of that information than it did healthy individuals. So what we're showing here is that there's a significant difference in how many repetitions of information are required for someone with a brain injury to learn that information than someone who does not have a brain injury. However, when we went on to look at recall and recognition, what we found was no difference. So what this is telling us is that once individuals with TBI were able to learn that information, once we provided enough exposure to that information that they were able to learn it, they remembered it at the same rate as individuals who did not have a brain injury. So now what? What we know here is that learning is a clear problem in individuals with brain injury. And our next step now is to identify an effective treatment that targets learning. What we want to do is treat the learning deficit. And what we then hope to see is an improvement in memory functioning, an improvement in someone's overall quality of life, as well as improved daily functioning. So in this work, the importance of treating cognitive deficits post-TBI is really emphasized. Cognitive rehabilitation is commonly used in inpatient and outpatient settings to treat cognition. Almost every inpatient and outpatient rehabilitation facility offer it. However, the evidence is lacking. It is building more recently, and what we see is that across domains, including attention, working memory, and executive functioning, we're seeing cognitive rehabilitation protocols show a base in data that's indicating that they actually do indeed work. We're also starting to see this across different outcomes. Most of the data really look at objective cognitive performance, which is a list learning task, which is given in a quiet testing environment. Some of the studies are starting to look at everyday life. Everyday life is really key because that is what people care about. People care about how they're functioning in their daily life. They don't care if they can remember 16 words on a CVLT that a neuropsychologist administers in a quiet office. And then we're also starting to show changes on neuroimaging. So what we're starting to show is that after a behavioral rehabilitation program for new learning, the brain is functioning differently. So when it's able to learn new information, we're seeing changes at the level of the brain, which is very encouraging. So despite the building literature, there are some major holes that remain. We really need class 1 evidence. Class 1 evidence utilizes rigorous methodology in randomized clinical trials and really provides the unrefutable scientific evidence that a particular cognitive rehabilitation protocol works. And the ultimate goal is to identify programs that work, to get them clinically out there to patients, and of course, to impact reimbursement rates. Someone needs to pay for this in order for them to get out there. Strategy training shows substantial promise across populations. There are very few methodologically rigorous studies, however, but empirical support for memory strategy training does exist in healthy controls. So much of this work has been done with healthy college students, and it shows that with strategy training, they make memory gains and that these gains remain over several months. Various techniques have been used, including visual imagery, story development, self-generation, self-testing, spaced learning, errorless learning, repetitive recall drills. And what's been seen is that recall performance improves. However, the data on the generalization to everyday life is limited. And as I mentioned, everyday life really is key because that's what people care about. And to date, no structured treatment protocols are available. In the work that we do, we've really focused in on the left side of the screen, the visual imagery, story development, self-generation, self-testing, and spaced learning. And that's for two reasons. One, errorless learning is very similar to self-generation, so there's a little bit of overlap there. And we have some data also showing that repetitive recall drills are not helpful for someone with a brain injury, that you really need to influence the semantic encoding and the quality of that encoding, not simply repeat information over time. So our research first started out focusing in on visual imagery and story development, and that was the focus of the 2007 to 2012 site-specific study for our TBI model system. And what we showed in the bar chart, you see that individuals who completed treatment, which are the two right bars, versus on the left side of the screen, you see controls. And what you see is the individuals who completed treatment showed a nice improvement from their baseline learning ability to their post-treatment learning ability, whereas controls showed a decline. We also showed changes on neuroimaging with increased activity in a decreased activity in the default mode network and increased activity in the executive control network, which indicated that the learning abilities were becoming easier for the individuals who had completed treatment, whereas it did not change in the controls. The current protocol that we're testing in our current model system utilizes self-generation, self-testing, and spaced learning, and combines that into a treatment protocol where we teach patients how to use these treatments and apply them to daily life. So self-generation is the belief that information that's self-generated is remembered better than information that's provided. So if I say it's unlucky to walk under A, most people will generate the word ladder. They'll remember ladder better than if I tell them to remember the word ladder. In an everyday life scenario, this could be when you go to the store, please pick up that stuff we use to clean our teeth. So you would generate toothpaste, and you would be more likely to remember that than if someone said to you, when you go to the store, please pick up toothpaste. Our data shows that this is data collected in a laboratory on the generation effect. And what we show is this, I want you to focus on these two middle lines. This dotted line is how healthy controls perform in a normal learning situation where they're just told to remember words. And right beneath that, the solid black line is how individuals with TBI perform when they are generating information. So what these two lines show us is that when they're generating information, individuals with TBI are able to learn information at a level similar to healthy controls in a normal learning environment. So the technique is really helping them. Spaced learning is the second technique taught in the protocol, and spaced learning refers to the fact that new learning is significantly improved when trials are distributed over time or spaced compared to consecutive learning trials or MASH trials. And this is the impetus for encouraging our students to study over a period of time and not cram the night before, because when we space things out over time, we remember them better. And this has more than 100 years of research that supports its legitimacy in healthy individuals. What we did is apply it to individuals with brain injury. And what we saw was that when information was spaced over time, these are individuals with brain injury who learned information spaced over time. The dotted black line was in a mass condition. And you see that when they're learning the information over time, they're much better able to remember that information after a delay. The third technique taught in this protocol is retrieval practice or self-testing. This is testing your memory for things that you were introduced to, and that results in greater retrieval of that information in the future than if you simply provide it to the person multiple times. In everyday life, think about quizzing. This is one of the reasons that we encourage quizzing in our educational system, because when you quiz someone on information, they remember it better. So you might think of the index card method, where you have a term on one side and on the other side you have a definition, and you test yourself. You don't simply read that information because it's more efficacious to do so. And what we found in TBI, if you look at the bars on the right, this is a combination mass retrieval practice spaced restudy condition. And what we see is that when we encourage people to combine those two techniques, they learn information at a much higher rate and they're able to remember it better over time. So taking these different techniques, we combine them and we created strategy-based strategy techniques to enhance memory. And this teaches people and significant others how to apply novel techniques in daily life. The focus is on improving everyday life. It teaches the application of spaced learning, self-testing, as well as self-generation. And it also tries to encourage the involvement of a significant other. It's an 8-session treatment protocol. You focus on the person with the brain injury, but when there's a significant other around that can attend, that is encouraged. So across the 8 sessions, in session 1, we focus on assessment results and memory education. So how is their memory? Where are their weaknesses and where are their strengths? In sessions 2 and 3, we focus on self-generation. Sessions 4 and 5, we focus on spaced learning. Sessions 6 and 7, self-testing. And then in session 8, we take these techniques, we combine them, and we apply them to everyday life. So there's quite a bit of each technique as well as the combination of the 3 that we focus on later in the treatment. We did publish pilot data on this technique in individuals with multiple sclerosis. And what we found post-treatment, again, we focused on everyday life because that's really what we want to change. And this is the mental health inventory. We saw an improvement on both on the left side of the screen on the behavioral control subscale and on the right side of the screen on the positive affect scale. We saw changes on the top of the screen. You see the SF-36 from before to after treatment. We see improvement. And then on the bottom of the screen, you see the functional assessment of multiple sclerosis. It's a general contentment scale. So similar to quality of life, where you see an improvement in the treatment group and a decrease in the control group. Our current site-specific study will involve 80 participants with moderate to severe TBI that are at least 1 year post-injury. They will have documented, or they do have documented, learning and memory deficits. And that's important because we want to make sure that we're treating a deficit that exists. That's the only way you're going to get data that's not confounded by various cognitive abilities or disabilities. This can be traumatic. Could be TBI model system patients or non-TBI model system patients. So it's really, it's not restricted to just the TBI model system enrollees. When patients enter the study, they're randomized to either a treatment group or a placebo control group. And then there's an outcome assessment where we look at objective cognitive functioning, which is a neuropsychological assessment, the CVLT, for those of you who might be familiar with it, which is a list of 16 words learned over 5 trials. But then we also do, and this is a very important part, the everyday life functioning assessment. And this includes questionnaires as well as an objective test of memory in daily life, really focusing in on memory, because what we want to improve is daily life functioning, because that's what people care about. Unfortunately, we don't have any results because it's a clinical trial. We're not allowed to break code prior to the end of the study. Our current N is 32. 25 have completed the long-term follow-up. There are 3 between the short and long-term follow-up, and the balance of that number are in treatment right now. Due to the pandemic, we had to change the protocol so that we were able to offer it over the computer. So we do offer people a format choice where they can either choose to do a remote treatment done via computer where they're in their homes and we're in our offices, or they could do it in person. And since we've had 9 people choose the remote option, and more recently people are starting to choose the in-person option again. So that's encouraging that people are willing to kind of get back into society and back into the research that we're doing. So that's the summary of our site-specific project. Dr. Golden and I really just want to touch a little bit on modular participation, and we're probably going to do this really briefly because we're running out of time. The modular participation is the third aspect of the TBI model system program. So you have the national data collection where all of our data is entered into a huge database that is about 20,000 people at this point in time. You have our site-specific studies, which Dr. Golden and I just went over, what's currently being conducted at JFK and at Kessler. And then the third component is modular participation, and every center must participate in at least one module. There are 10 ongoing modules, and the centers select the modules they participate in based on their interests and their resources. Every module must have at least 4 participating centers, so it has to be a collaborative network. We communicate with each other via monthly conference calls or Zooms, and then we have quarterly data submissions. These are the current modules for the 2017-2022 grant cycle. And in the interest of time, we were going to go over each one and their current status, but in the interest of time, I think we're just going to quickly describe them. So the problem-solving training for care partners of adults with traumatic brain injuries during inpatient rehabilitation is one that both JFK and Kessler participate on. This is conducted on the inpatient unit or remotely now due to the COVID restrictions. But what we're really doing in this study is we're working with the care partners of adults who have recently had brain injuries prior to them going home to assist them with problem-solving training and help them prepare for what's going to happen when they get home. Kessler is participating in a caregiver resilience longitudinal investigation, which looks at caregivers over time and how they fare over time. We're also participating in health literacy following traumatic brain injury and its impact on health-related outcomes. We're participating in a menopause study, particularly to women with TBI, looking at the interaction between menopause and recovery from traumatic brain injury and how that impacts daily life. And then we're also participating in trajectories of cognitive functioning after TBI, which is a longitudinal study that follows people years post-traumatic brain injury and examines their cognitive functioning and how it changes over time. And I'm just going to ask Dr. Golden to comment briefly on return to driving after moderate to severe TBI, which is something that the JFK is participating in.
Sure. So JFK is participating in the return to driving after TBI module. There are 2 components. One is to evaluate all patients who are up for follow-up. This is the cross-sectional component to examine trends and rates of driving, and for non-drivers to examine barriers related to non-driving. So we're looking at things like accidents. We're looking at things like decisions related to somebody not pursuing returning to driving and other aspects of driving and life. And then there's the longitudinal component where we're following participants across the first 2 years of injury to study their rates of returning to driving, how long it takes them to resume driving, and also assess any barriers or factors that they include in their decisions whether or not to return to driving. We're collecting information from participants, but also from caregivers when available. We've already completed the cross-sectional component and just published the paper on it, and we are wrapping up our longitudinal component in the next couple of months and already preparing a manuscript.
So with that, I'm going to conclude this part of our workshop because we only have about 5 minutes left. I know I did see some questions in the chat earlier, so
Dr. Charavaloke, do you want me to read the questions?
if you can do that, that would be great because I'm having trouble navigating.
All right. Okay. So the first question is, did I misunderstand that many factors eliminate community integration as a treatment domain?
Okay. I'm assuming that was intended for me. So I would say no. Community reintegration does not get eliminated as the treatment domain, because that is the ultimate goal of rehabilitation, is community reintegration. But what I intended to communicate is that the way that we assess community reintegration and the factors that we consider when thinking about community reintegration needs to take into account activity limitations as well as other domains. And activity limitations in the context of providing rehabilitation is the best proxy for determining somebody's capacity for community reintegration. As in terms of just their ability. Now, there are going to be other factors that play a role that we have no control over and sometimes don't have the ability to assess in the context of rehabilitation. So if somebody is not cooking, it may not necessarily mean that they are unable to engage in those activities. It might mean that they have a caregiver who's doing the cooking for them. It may mean that they are fearful of being at the stove. It may mean that they have meals delivered to them. It may mean they don't have access to an area where they can cook. It may mean that they're financially destitute and don't have access to food. So traditional measurement of participation doesn't take
3 minutes.
Okay, doesn't take into account all those factors. And that's what I intended to communicate.
Thank you, Golden. The next question is, I can clearly see how NJ-TBI model is supporting mild to moderate TBI patients. How this system is or will help vegetative or minimally conscious TBI population? Thank you.
That's a great question given our keynote this morning. The TBI model system enrolls patients when they're admitted into inpatient rehabilitation, and a subsample of those patients do have disorders of consciousness. So within our database, we do have a substantial number of individuals who are at various stages in their disorder, in a disorder of consciousness. In addition to that, we have one aspect of the TBI model system that we did not mention was our special interest groups, or SIGs. So there are probably 15 SIGs that we have where the different model system investigators join SIGs that are of interest to them. One of our SIGs is disorders of consciousness. And you probably heard our keynote speaker mention Joe Giacino several times, who used to be at JFK, is now up at Boston. He's one of the major players in that SIG, as well as John White, who he also mentioned during the keynote. So these are leading TBI researchers that are specifically interested in disorders of consciousness and do work with that population as a subpopulation of the TBI model system. So just like the rest of the patients, they're being followed for years and years post-injury. And there's a great deal of work that comes out of that SIG in regard to disorders of consciousness.
Thank you, Dr. Shravali. The third question is,
I
Dr.
hate
Gold.
to break in here, but this workshop is closing. We would like our attendees to please enter your name in the chat to sign out of this workshop. And then don't forget to complete the workshop evaluation. Also, don't forget that if you are getting CEUs from a particular discipline that requires a post-test, to please take your post-test. The next workshop is going to be at 11:55. So during this short break, please take the opportunity to visit with our exhibitors, and they are at BIANJ.org/exhibitors, and also complete a visit with our poster presentations. We have about 6 presentations out there, also dealing with brain injury issues. So again, this workshop has ended. Thank you. Have a great day.